Hey guys, happy Christmas. Hope everyone's well. So I wrote a little Christmas story this week and I thought I'd share it with you since there's nothing else better to do, and hopefully it will cheer you up. It's called A Very 2020 Christmas. 'Twas the first day of December, and all throughout the world, kids and adults alike were opening the tiny little cardboard doors on their advent calendars, eating their first taste of Christmas chocolate and settling in for the most magical time of the year. In a snow-roofed cabin in Lapland, Santa had his feet up, and as he sat by the fire, his mind was full of logistics, names, lists, locations, directions, and above all, a stress headache. Christmas toy making was always a stressful process. In order to make enough, Santa and the elves had to start early in the year. Because trends and hot toys change so quickly, normally the elves spend the first few months of the year making the timeless classics they can be sure will always be loved. Candy canes, chocolate coins, bikes, toy cars, dolls. This year had started well. That was until February. March had been the start of the chaos. The trendometer, a giant tall candy cane aerial mast on top of Santa's house that scans the world for what people are liking and wanting, had started picking up so many signals that the elves had to rush and unplug it to stop it overheating. They'd suddenly been inundated with wishing requests for tiger merchandise, and having spent months stockpiling stripy tiger gifts, people had changed their minds and seemed to be over it. Santa has been tripping over the damn things ever since. Santa, huffing and puffing, had to move the entire lot into his loft, squeezing it in next to a sleigh full of anthropomorphic carrot characters he was still trying to shift from last year. Santa hates trends. They make life stressful. And that had just been the start. Musical instruments for budding future musicians had been cast aside in favour of gifts that seemed a little more cyber. The magic 8 balls had gone wrong, and no matter how hard the elves tried to calibrate them, the predictions were always negative. And then there was the growing problem of baby Yodas, which seemed to Santa like the final kick in the balls. It now appeared, after making them all, that he would only be able to deliver these to British kids this year, and any surplus stock would have to be destroyed or at least over-labelled on account of the fact that they all contained soon-to-be ineligible or European CE kite mark symbols. It was turning out to be an annus horribilis. More overstocks was the last thing he needed. Back in April, following a very heated argument with the chief elf over rising stock levels of dash cams, Mr. Chief Elf Candy Pants had quit. In his haste, and due to it being an emergency situation, Santa ignored the usual process and rules and had handed the contract for Chief Elf to one of his friends. Despite his friend having no previous experience of sourcing toys, it hadn't ended well, and they were now further behind. No toys had materialised, but his friend was now unimaginably rich. In hindsight, Santa had panicked. The truth was, Santa didn't understand dash cams or the types of people who wanted them. He didn't think he'd be friends with those sort of people. But then he felt the same about people who wore Bluetooth headsets, and despite still having lots of these left over too from a few years ago, he knew that accepting other people's opinions was part of the true spirit of Christmas, so he let the issue slide, while gently grumbling to himself that he is indeed a fairly good judge of character and therefore was probably right. Being a good judge of character was, of course, critical in the creation of the annual good and naughty lists. This year, the good list seemed brimming with good souls, and it had been the best of times and the worst of times. For the majority, human kindness had flowed in abundance, and the good list had been easy. There were familiar faces, of course. Greta, who was top of the list last year, was of course still present, although it took Santa a while to find her, and she seemed a little less relevant this year somehow. Marcus had been busy all year ensuring children in Britain were always fed, and his name had shone off the page like a beacon. But something troubled him as he looked across the room this evening. The naughty list seemed longer and sadder than ever. There were, of course, no surprises with some of the names. Little Donald was there again for the 74th year in a row. This year, even by his standards, he had not been good. He'd not played fairly with the other boys, and he'd refused to accept that he'd lost some important games. Many people had made the list through selfishness, which made him sad. People taking a little more than they needed, or thinking their own convenience was more important than perhaps what was better for everyone. People who had taken foreign holidays. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd put these on the list. He'd added these people, then crossed them out, and then added the names again for some nagging sensation that wouldn't leave him alone. It just hadn't sat quite right with him. The word eaten, with a question mark, was scribbled in the corner of the naughty list. Santa had remembered making this note, but now on the 20th of December, looking back, he had completely forgotten why, and he ignored it, hoping to God that it wasn't important. And so it was that he climbed into bed that evening, exhausted with some niggles and nervousness he hadn't felt in years, but in the hope deep down in his wobbly belly that come the big day, all would be fine. The following morning, Santa awoke to a sneeze. Not his sneeze, it must be said. Not that of Mrs. Claus. It wasn't the elves. It's a well-known fact that the elves are actually incapable of sneezing. They have but one bodily function, and that is farting candy. Try and forget that fact when you open your Christmas stocking candy on Christmas morning. No, the sneeze had come from the stables next door. When Santa entered the stable, he saw his favourite reindeer sitting in the corner with a line in the hay, marking a circle 2 meters around him. His nose shone brightly. Too brightly. It was redder than it should be. Rudolph was ill. Under the current rules, he was required to send off for an elf check and was made to self-isolate for 10 days or until his test came back. The other reindeers too. It was a disaster. The bad news was there was no way at all they'd be able to fly on the 24th. This was the worst year ever, thought Santa, who still remembered 2016 like it was only last year, and was frankly quite surprised that this low benchmark had been broken. The night of the 24th was not all lost. As Santa climbed into his sleigh, at a loss for how this would all work, he began to sob. As his first tear landed on his beard, the sleigh jerked into action and began to rise. Lifted not by the magic reindeer, but by the love, hopes, togetherness and goodwill of millions of people all the way around the world, who needed and willed Christmas to happen more than in any year they could remember. The sleigh wobbled and then lifted up in the air. The weight of 1,000,000 baby Yodas and Ring doorbells was nothing compared to the Christmas cheer that powered it. Through the cold Christmas Eve night, Santa flew to all of the countries of the world. Over Britain and its many castles, Windsor, York, Durham, Barnard Castle. He was actually surprised to see so many people were there in the grounds of the castle, when he'd reasonably expected them to be safely at home. Santa adjusted his glasses to check his eyesight. He could see the castle more clearly now, and his eyes felt better. It was a truly magical night, and despite the lack of reindeer And guided by a dashcam and a 2018 TomTom instead of Rudolph, he was indeed able to make Christmas 2020 happen. Not the best Christmas ever, but Christmas nonetheless. And when children and adults awoke on the morning of Christmas Day, the world united in love, families, both virtually and some physically, and for the first day in a long time, the world seemed a little lighter. Rudolph, who had been thoroughly checked over by the elf department, was cleared of anything more than a little tinselitis, and joined Santa, Mrs. Claus, and all of his reindeer friends for the best, albeit the first, and hopefully the only, lockdown Christmas Day ever. The end. Hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful Christmas. Look after yourselves. And see you all the other side. Stay safe, everybody. Cheers.